Merci beaucoup. Alors Nadia va rester là pour la deuxième table ronde.
Thank you very much. Nadia is now going to stay here for the second roundtable.
Une deuxième table ronde où les invités sont le professeur Youba SOKONA, ancien vice-président du GIEC, et
We
Madame
have
Marie-Thérèse
Professor Youba SOKONA,
Daba,
former
SENE,
IPCC chair, and
sociologue
Marie-Thérèse
représentant de One
Daba,
Planet Fellowship, sur les
sociologist,
perspectives, donc une table ronde sur les perspectives de la recherche africaine sur le climat.
a roundtable on the perspectives of African research on climate.
Alors, merci à tous les deux de nous rejoindre. Donc,
Thank you so much to the two of you for joining us for the last discussion, but not the least because we're going to talk about research, science, and projects to roll out the initiatives that are being proposed by the old school, if I may call it this way, and by the younger people, because here is an initiative from young researchers, and we'll let them start if you agree. Marie-Thérèse, I will ask you to present the objective of this initiative.
Bonjour à tous. Alors, merci Nadine pour cette introduction. Et c'est un plaisir de prendre la parole avant.
Hello everyone, thank you Nadine for this introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to talk before the professor because we are going to present the perspectives of young African researchers. Imagine 120 African researchers from 14 countries of English and French-speaking countries, all gathered around a common objective, which is to produce innovative solutions and practices that are adapted to the challenges of climate change in Africa. And this is particularly interesting because today I have the honor of representing 120 winners of the Planet Fellowship program, and we have published a collective advocacy letter aiming and asking donors, governors, and decision makers for additional fundings for African research on the challenges of climate change in Africa. And this is particularly important because we really lack probing data in order to better characterize climate change observed currently, but also in the future, as Dr. Aida Jonku highlighted earlier, there's also a lack of fundings. The funding is insufficient. For example, from 1990 to 2020, only 3.8% of global climate research funds were allocated to Africa-related research, and most of those fundings go to American and European institutions and not African institutions. We also note that there are publications on global warming with very few African researchers. There are also issues to access and publish, which relates to the high cost of publications in scientific publications. And the young researchers of the One Planet Fellowship program have implemented innovative solutions for an actually African agriculture that is more resilient, more productive, and that consumes less water by developing strategies and innovative technologies, but also by diversifying crops and by proposing varieties and species that are resilient to droughts. Solutions proposed by researchers who worked on this note, and I can mention Nigeria with Doris Fremont, who experiences the biochar, and we have Cécile Harmony in Burkina Faso, who promotes deep draining, but also the use of biofertilizers that are adapted to rice crop. In Senegal and in Benin, the work of Mamshodna and Emeline on the use of agroforestry with sustainable solutions. So we can see that there are solutions implemented by African researchers that meet the needs of local populations. And this is particularly important because we need these populations to get involved in order to reach solutions that can be efficient to the effect of climate change in Africa. And this is what I discovered in my research by working with 3,600 women in Senegal who are very active in environmental solutions. For example, the use of biopesticides and good usage of water. And they managed to produce high volumes that really allow them to hope for social and economical self-sufficiency. And despite constraints relating to gender, in terms of land access for women, they still manage to succeed thanks to those innovative solutions. And I want to tell you that those solutions coming from research are not just a hope for those 2,500 women, because I was really touched by the testimony of a woman saying that thanks to this income, she can pay for school fees for her children at university, but thanks to this income, she can also get self-value perceived by her husband, by her community, because the impact of our work is really noticeable. All this to say that those solutions coming from African research, from African researchers, provide tangible solutions, hope for those 2,500 women, for their daughters who can now go to university thanks to their mother's income, for this woman who gets more self-esteem, and for small producers who know that despite irregular rains, they will manage to ensure production. The hope of a young African who knows that now, thanks to the solutions developed by research, they can make a living out of agriculture and not get into clandestine crops. And for those solutions to contribute to hope, it is crucial to increase fundings, but also to equip African research infrastructures, the labs, improving working conditions of African researchers. And I believe Fidel, who's here, will be able to testify of the constraints that African researchers face due to a lack of infrastructure. It is also important to favor free access to research results and also scientific publications. And we drafted this note, which is available. Do not hesitate to read it. And we will have another note available soon, co-signed by all the winners of the One Planet Fellowship program, available on the Agropolis Foundation website. They are present today in the room. And I was particularly moved today by one of the conclusions from Dr. Fadel when he said it's time to act. And I believe this commitment really resonates with Adama, Ines, and all the 120 winners that I represent here today. It is possible to implement solutions from researchers, intergenerational researchers, on the fight against climate change, and it's really time to have a strong action so that African research can have an impact, especially from young researchers. Thank you.
Je voudrais juste te demander pour
I would just like to ask you, in order to really understand this initiative, are these 120 researchers work in a network? And how many countries do they represent in Africa? In total, that's 14 English and French-speaking countries. Countries like Senegal, Burkina, represented today, Benin, Ethiopia, Malawi, Tanzania. And as part of this program, we've had an interesting exercise about draft or writing scientific articles together with researchers from different specialties. Despite the language barrier, we had 3 French speakers, 3 English speakers, so we had to collaborate and try and implement common research, and some of them were actually published. And that's a great progress. And as part of the program, we also have mentoring, leadership trainings, and there's also a dedicated part on scientific training of young researchers in European labs. And I believe more than 50 winners benefited from this, including myself, because I'm currently doing an internship at the Research Center of the European Commission in Italy. I mainly work on gender issues relating to agroeconomy in Senegal. Thank you, Marie-Thérèse. Youba. First of all, I think that this program is mainly dedicated to adaptation. Could you talk to us about your initiative on strategies for African countries? Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this meeting on such important topics of concern and that are particularly complex. Marie-Thérèse just told me that I could use my fishing gear right now. In 1988, I went to Boston at university to work on an energy planning model. We thought we could resolve the energy issues in Africa within 2 to 3 years. And I thought, after this, I can go fishing. But up until now, I still haven't used the fishing gear. So I now have a chance to do it. Anyway, I think it's important, and we should try and talk about Africa and the climate by being more lucid, because ultimately, and that was discussed today, we need an African narrative. Not about climate, but about development. And those two are not opposed, climate and development. And one of the fundamental aspects is that energy is at the heart of development, and development is at the heart of climate. And those coming from Western Africa or Burkina know it. The issues we're facing in West Africa is debolosting or offloading. And this has an impact on everything when there's no electricity for several hours. But based on this, and we know in the African context that there are skills in all industries. Marie-Thérèse said it. We have young researchers. And unfortunately, she didn't mention any African institution, and that's the most important problem. And I was given a chance to implement the Action Climate Policy Center in 2010 at the UN Committee on Africa. And I implemented a program to attract young African PhDs. And at the time, every year, we took 15 of them, and within 5 years, we had a critical mass of experts in all areas, from science, climate, adaptation, vulnerability, mitigation, etc. The first year, when he launched this program, there were 15 positions and more than 100 applicants, people based in the US and all over the world, who came to Africa to work on those issues, which shows that there is an opportunity and a will to work on those topics and to come to Africa to do so. Except that we are noting more and more that Africans are leaving Africa. If you look at the Dakar University, most of the most experienced teachers have left. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Japan, and the most surprising thing I observed in Japan is that they follow the Canadian model. Those who study in Japan stay in Japan and work in Japan. That's what the Japanese do. And in the African context, we thought we have complex issues that are inextricable. And in the negotiations, the Africans don't have their own narrative. Same for the climate. There's an opposition between adaptation and mitigation. When, in the African context, this concept of adaptation vs mitigation does not exist. There isn't this topic of transition either. And that applies to coal, which we don't mention at all. This is mainly about building a system that is low carbon or carbon neutral. We are building systems in the African system. It is to be built. The infrastructures are to be built. It doesn't have to be a transition like in the West. And since it's difficult, we had the idea to create an African institute like the IASA that invests, works in the short term and at the same time on the long term. Because regardless of the concerns, regardless of the area, there are 4 important prerequisites. First one, having a vision. Leadership, a clear vision of things. The second part is to have the institutions that are capable of translating this vision into something actionable. The third element is to have the means. We often talk about financial means, but rarely talk about human means that are much more important than financial means. The fourth prerequisite is to get to work on the short term while investing in the long term. And this requires the creation of a new institution. So in October of last year, we created an African Institute for Sustainable Energy and System Analysis, which is based on the model of the IPCC. We don't need high fundings for this. I worked for more than 30 years within the IPCC and I was never paid for it. So there's a possibility to invest in this institute. People are committed. We have almost 160 African and non-African people working in this project all over the world. And the IPCC showed that you can release significant reports without being located in the same place. That was demonstrated by the IPCC. A third element is to give a platform to young people like Marie-Thérèse so that they can get to work on topics that are interesting to them and interesting to Africa, because the main issue of Africa is to find institutions where you can get involved, where you can continue to have a reflection and have an intellectual production. And we must absolutely find a relationship between politics, practice, and reflection. Most of the time, we struggle to do this, and with this new institution in October, we have 4 priority pillars. First, what are the potential to navigate low carbon or carbon neutral energies in Africa? Second pillar, efficiency of the implementation of programs and projects in the African context. And the third pillar is around access to technology and fundings in a more sustainable way. The fourth pillar, which is cross-functional, is around institutional capacities, because we're lacking institutions. In the 1980s, I could have made a list of at least 20 institutions working on energy in Africa, energy and development. Today, I would be unable to mention more than 3 outside of South Africa. And this pillar is mainly focusing on institutional capacities and human resources. We also plan on organizing an in-person meeting. We had a series of online meetings in South Africa in September with the creation of 2 hubs. One hub for English-speaking countries and one hub for the French-speaking countries, because a huge effort must be done in the French-speaking countries. First of all, getting an African narrative, defining a work program for Africa, and getting out of mimicking, including what is called transition in Africa, which is an abuse of language when the system is still to be built. And secondly, having a permanent navigation between science, that is knowledge, policy at different levels, local, national, regional, and the practice. So this is a summary of this initiative, which is a platform for Marie-Thérèse and her colleagues. Thank you very much, Youba. I will give you the name of the initiative again. AISESA. You can find it on Google, because that's one of the questions we got. Would an African country be better positioned to be a leader in research on climate? It's not about having an African country to be a leader, but having Africans to be leaders, regardless of availability, but also non-African people who are interested in African issues to work on this. Just to give you an idea, the OECD countries in 2020, and I believe we have a representative of the OECD in the room, in 2020, the OECD used $1,500 billion in research and development. And that same year, Africa only dedicated $9 billion. So compare $1,500 billion and $9 billion on crucial issues and fundamental issues. So that shows a great difference. And most of the time, every time we cover those crucial issues, then we end up talking about funding. And we avoid the substantial issues, energy, agriculture, development, and it always ends up being an issue of funding. So we avoid the real problems. And through the creation of this institute, we want to address those issues up front and not just reduce it to the issue of funding. Another question, the decline of the institutions you mentioned since the 90s, what are the reasons for this? The reasons are well known and well documented. Structural issues. It's only now that we're seeing the impact of structural assistance. African countries were told you can close your university, you don't need the expertise. We have it. And research centers were replaced by consultants. somebody at a university is a consultant, a researcher, dedicates much more time to do consulting than actually producing a reflection. A ministry, regardless of the type, be it on substantial issues, never meets academics to ask them for a reflection, to just pay a consultant for a report. And that's the issue of structural adjustments. Research centers, universities have been dismantled, and they're hard to restart. Some sort of barrier was created between the administration and the research world. There is no communication. And our former minister of Burkina can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no communication between the technical departments and the research structures in universities. And this was created by structural adjustment programs.
Comment on peut l'expliquer?
So, about the funding gap, how can it be explained, this underinvestment? Is it due to a lack of interest from the political world for science or research? Earlier, I said that when you start, you tend to forget about the foundations of those structural adjustment programs, and just like the university structure was dismantled, when people decided that they should focus on basic education and thought that research or universities were useless, through those programs, the request was for those institutions to be self-sufficient. I talked about data with somebody. They're supposed to be self-sufficient, but to get data, you need to pay for them. And that was one of the consequences of structural adjustment programs, which led African countries not to be interested. They are being asked to insist on the productive sector, as these sectors are considered as not productive. And since they're not self-sufficient, when you have a report like the one presented by Fadel, some of us had to get together and say, there's a lot of speeches on energy transition, but they have nothing to do with the African context. First, we started trying to approach the African Union to work with them. We had a preliminary work, but it was never concluded. And we thought, okay, let's just forget about those institutions, try and produce a reflection on something that we consider much more relevant to the African perspectives. At first, we thought we would follow the 2063 agenda in Africa. Before the 2030 agenda, everybody talks about this one, but nobody talks about the 2063 agenda designed by Africa, which is about Africa in 50 years, and that should be used as the foundation to discuss issues around the climate, energy, etc. In order to get Marie-Thérèse to react to this initiative, I'm going to ask her what she imagines for 10 or 20 years to come for herself as a young researcher, based on what Youba just said on creating institutions that could help integrate research. Thank you, Nadine. That's a great question, because since yesterday with Adama, we were wondering, are we going to stay in research or not after a diploma? Because we wonder whether there are institutions who can welcome us, support us as young researchers, and I feel reassured when I hear Professor Youba talking about this. So it's a good initiative. And in my personal case, I'm a trained sociologist, but I'm thinking that research on climate change in Africa is a personal commitment first. I decided to work on gender issues in relationship with climate change and agriculture. And when I see the impact of climate change on my home village, the impact on women who must fetch water, who must bring the food, they take care of crops. And this choice really made me more comfortable in working on this topic, and it made me change during my PhD to work on this theme. So it is a personal commitment, and when you know that you can get support, you can get the equipment, the infrastructure to support young researchers, is a hope for the younger generation. So we don't really need to think, okay, maybe after my PhD, I might need to look for a job abroad, maybe be a consultant, etc. Because we know that there are ongoing initiatives created by researchers who came before us and who can be actual mentors for us. And that's why it's necessary to develop those mentoring programs, and we do it with the organization because we get support from African institution researchers, and to me it's a great initiative for us young researchers.
Youba, un mot de conclusion.
Yuba, would you like to conclude? What you're asking is just like Marie-Thérèse said, it's a personal commitment. All of the people in the Institute, that's a commitment. They dedicate part of their time to work for free for the Institute. So some might say, well, I'm going to spend 1 hour of my time a week for the Institute, others 1 week, others a month. And it's truly, the idea is to create a platform for young people. That's essential. To define when we have a funding, usually we work with the agenda of the person funding us. And we want to define our own agenda. We have to be independent. That's the reason why the Institute so far is virtual. The idea of that Institute dates back to more than 15 years ago. So we defined that context 15 years ago, and it takes time to define that institute. This is because of COVID, so that's one of the positive impacts of COVID. And we gained that project back. So we have a virtual institute where we don't depend on external funding. The only thing we have is people who are committed, and it doesn't matter where people are. Some are in Australia, some are in Papua New Guinea, some are in France here. Nadia also took her on to be a part of the institute. Doesn't matter where we are. And young people try to work on a project that is defined by Africans for Africans.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais vous remercier tous les deux d'avoir participé.
And the idea is to have the well-being of people at the center of the project. So thank you both for having taken part in that discussion.
Alors, c'est maintenant temps de clore cette journée de forum. Donc, vous voulez remercier encore une fois